The title of this talk is actually the subtitle of my book, published a few years ago, Charleston Fancy, and it's a book about the three sort of themes of many of my books. One is architecture, the second is real estate development, which is very much at the center of this, and also urbanism, because it's a book about Charleston and its history and why the effect it has on people who move here and build here and live here. I'm not going to talk about the city today. I'm only going to talk a bit about one project. As you know, Charleston is a peninsula at the intersection of rivers and that meander off into the backcountry. Those little blocks are the projects that I discussed. This is a book basically not about buildings, but as our speaker said, it's about people. And I'll finish off with that thought at the end of the talk. But these are projects that this group of people that I met about the first maybe 30 years ago, and I started writing much more recently about it, but they've done all sorts of projects throughout this area. Large projects and small projects, projects that didn't get built, projects that did get built. And what I'm going to talk about is one particular project. So this is a kind of story. It's not a theoretical talk. It's not about how to do it or whether anybody else could do this. As you'll see, my conclusion is not necessarily. But it's very much a story over about 17 years or more. It starts in 2011 and moves to the present day. It starts in actually 2005, earlier. Jerry Moran is a retired Air Force pilot and Delta pilot, and he, after retirement for health reasons, basically, he started dabbling with friends, and that's very much part of my story, in buying old buildings and fixing them up and adding to them, and in the center of Charleston, not in the historic area, which is way out of price range of these very modest developer builders, but sort of what is now a central area, but which was very peripheral in 2005. So he for complicated tax reasons that I talk about in the book, he needed to buy a house, and he bought this Freedman's Cottage. These were buildings built just after the Civil War, as the name implied, by Freedman. They're not exactly single houses because they're usually one story. They're not very large. But they have a porch on the side, and this was a sort of a relic of that period, probably more than 100+ years old at this point. But what interested Jerry was the lot. Charleston is unusual because the lots are very deep. Typical lots are 100 feet, most American cities. These are 200 feet. It's also unusual because the city encourages people to densify. So as long as you can meet the normal building code requirements and provide parking, adequate parking, you can add small buildings, one large building or several small buildings to the back of the lot. And Jerry had experience, which I describe in the book, with other people, with his colleagues in doing this. And so he knew that you could add as many as 3 small buildings at the back of this long, not very wide lot. And that's what really interested him, as well as initially restoring the house so that you could rent it out. And you can see here, it's simply fixed up. The big change was on the inside, because when they started pulling off the sheetrock, which was sort of rotting, they discovered underneath beautiful wood sort of paneling, or not really paneling, cladding, with many layers of paint. Over the years, people had every few years repainted. The paint didn't last very long in those days, so it needed more than one layer. And what they decided to do was simply to preserve it. So that this is not a scene under construction. This is a finished product that you're looking at here, and it's simply varnished. And it's this beautiful somewhat recherche sort of look for an interior. I should admit that when the house was finally sold, not too many years ago, the first thing the new owners did was paint it white. So there you go. But it's rather beautiful in this present state of this kind of a collage, memory collage of what was there over the years. Once that was done in 2008, 3 years later, he and his colleagues built the first house. They wanted to experiment with wood construction. Most of their buildings are concrete block because, as you know, this is a hurricane area, wood rots, and so, but they did want to, George Holt, who is Jerry's partner in these endeavors, wanted to try a wooden construction, and so they built this small house, 3 stories, very small footprint. In Philadelphia, where I live, this would be called the Trinity House because it's basically one room, 3 rooms, one above the other. The difference in Philadelphia, they tend to be row houses, whereas in Charleston, all these houses in this first part of the talk are individual houses. Jerry and George had a lot of experience at this point in doing these kind of projects, and their approach was to make houses that were very small. These are typically 700, 800, 600 square feet, but very high quality to sort of balance the size, which allows them to build several of these things on a lot, with a high degree of finish on the inside, sort of like a Honda Civic, if you think back to the 70s. It's not as big as the American cars, but it's very nicely finished. And it turned out that many car buyers appreciated that. And I think home buyers also, the demographic in Charleston is unusual because there are many, many students. There are about 7,000, I think, students at the College of Charleston. There's a medical school, a legal school. And of course, there are many, because it's a tourist city, there are many waiters and waitresses and bartenders and individual people. So if you have a room that has a little bathroom and maybe a kitchenette, that's something that a lot of people want to rent from you. And as George says, then you pay your taxes with this one room in your house that you can rent out. Andrew Gould was an old student of mine at Penn, and he sort of immigrated to Charleston, became at first a kind of apprentice and then a partner with George in these building endeavors. And his family was growing, and he decided he really needed a house for himself. And Jerry sold him this little lot at the back of the lot where Andrew built this quite beautiful little house, sort of based on the very early Charleston houses, which were Dutch in inspiration. This is a cement block house plastered on the outside, reinforced windows. Andrew's a very conscientious builder as well as being a talented designer. The ground floor is a workshop. He runs a little business making ecclesiastical sort of accessories. There's a whole story of building an Orthodox church at Ion that is part of the book. So the house is a 3-story house above that. That's the front door that you see there. And again, very beautifully finished on the inside. Andrew's a real craftsman in addition to being an architect, and you can see that in the details and the finished quality of the interior. Again, tiny, but very, very sort of cozy because of the quality of the finishes. From his experience, Jerry knew that the bigger, if you could get more than one lot, there were advantages. If you could assemble 2 lots, you could turn it into a sort of condominium arrangement, and that gave you advantages in working out places for parking and things like that. And he approached the neighbor to the north, which is that the big rectangle, asking him if he wanted to participate in this project. And the neighbor said no, he didn't think so, but he'd be happy to sell him the back half of his lot, which is the yellow rectangle. So Jerry bought that to enlarge his property. It was simply an empty piece of ground, but Jerry figured you could build 2 or even 3 houses on that space. At this point, there's a new character in the story. Reed Burgess was a mandolin bluegrass player, which is an odd background for a developer, but you never know. I know many developers, and they all have kind of unusual backgrounds. They're lawyers, accountants, engineers, all sorts of things. This is the first mandolin player I've met. And his group had 2 best-selling albums, but as musical groups do, it sort of drifted apart, and Reed was looking for basically a new direction in his life. He had taken the ICAA class in New York. He was living in Brooklyn then, in architecture, and he got fascinated by Palladio, and he wanted to build a Palladian house. And you can see that little yellow square is a landlocked lot that belonged to somebody, and he approached the owner, and the owner was willing to sell, and because it was landlocked, it was not super expensive, it was pretty small. And Reed wanted to base a design on a building by Robert Mills in Charleston, the parish house at the Congregational Church. And he figured he could scale it down and it would just fit in that little rectangle. Unfortunately, the city turned down his application and said, it's landlocked, it's not on a street, we really can't give you a building permit. So Reed was rather downcast, and Jerry, to help him out, said, oh, well, I can sell you a piece of the land that I just bought north, on that north section I showed you, and you can build a house there. Of course, the design wouldn't work because it would be an attached house. And so there's the house that was finally built. It was about half of the lot. So a very different arrangement than the previous design. So Reed's design was based on the Villa Saraceno, which he and George had gone to New York. I don't know if you remember, I think it was at the Morgan Library. There was a big Palladio exhibit sometime in the early 2000s. And Villa Saraceno is the smallest Palladian villa. It's still pretty big. It's certainly much bigger than the site that Reed had. And so he decided, what if you took the loggia and then just turned that into the house? That 3-arched area that leads to the house. And in fact, that's what he did. It's a 1-room kind of studio apartment on the ground floor, but in the back, with windows in the opposite direction, are 2 small rental units, 1-room units with a staircase on each side. It's very small, but it actually does feel Palladian. One reason is that it's a very tall ceiling, like most of Palladio's villas, and it has the same sort of construction that Palladio uses in many of his villas. And it has that sort of scale, which is sort of a contradiction because it's a miniature, but it has the scale of a Palladian villa. And that area with the open doors is actually a kitchenette behind those bifold doors, and then on the other side is a little bathroom, and it's this one big room. The arrangement with the stairs means that it could be a 2-bedroom unit, or you can rent the rooms, or you can rent one of the rooms. It's very kind of flexible arrangement. At the same time as they were building Reed's house, they built a house for Jerry's sister, who had just come back from Ireland. She was divorced and not in great health, and George designed this. It's too complicated to go into in my talk, but I talk a lot about it in the book because it's very ingeniously designed to accommodate somebody who may need a nursing care at one point, who will have limitations on movement. The kitchen is designed so you're not bending down all the time and things like that. It's a very beautiful house. I think one of the most beautiful collaborations of George and Andrew's. And it sort of underlines part of this story is that if you're building in Charleston, there isn't a Charleston style. There is a Charleston style which is a kind of banal idea of a Charleston style, which is the sort of what people were building in a few decades of the colonial period. But Charleston, of course, is a very much older city than that, and there's all sorts of architecture in Charleston. There's sort of Midwestern bungalows in parts of Charleston. There's at least 2 Moorish buildings that I know about in Charleston. So it's like all cities, it has a mixture of things, and there isn't a prescribed style for Charleston. And as you see, you have Palladio sitting next door to a kind of Dutch or maybe Queen Anne mixture type of building. That box is actually the kitchen, which I should also add that this, because of parking requirements, they had to provide parking underneath. They were running out of parking spaces. You have to have 2 spaces for each house you build. Most of the parking is tandem parking. So that's what that Mary, in fact, didn't have a car, so she used it as a sort of outdoor sitting area, kind of like a porch. It is a little bit odd that it has to be on 1 floor up, but there are arrangements for one of those stair elevators, should she have needed that at one point. In 2011, the other site on the other side of the lot came up for sale, and this was the only other chance to expand his holding, so Jerry became interested in it. Buyers were approaching this elderly black couple who lived in the house and offering to buy the house, so this was sort of the last chance to enlarge his holding. It was a very old house. It was called a Blue Chip because the ground floor was originally a bar. It had long since been boarded up and was basically uninhabitable. And the couple lived in some of the rooms upstairs. The house was in really pretty bad shape. So they were happy to sell it and be able to move to a newer house in North Charleston where their children lived. Again, Jerry's thought was very much to sell off the back part of the house. And as it happens, Andrew's parents, who were from Massachusetts, decided to retire to Charleston to be close to their grandchildren. There were, I think, 2 or 3 of them at this point. And they bought the back part with the thought that they would build a house and then there would be space. They might build a second house for rent or sale or something like that. And that the Blue Square is the house which they built, designed, of course, by Andrew, who was their son. It's an unusual house because it's a cottage. When you look at this, you don't think, oh, of course, that's Charleston. It wasn't. And in fact, Andrew had a bit of a time getting this through the Board of Architectural Review because they said, oh, you can't build a cottage. It's not really Charleston. Again, they have this, I think, narrow-minded idea of what a Charleston house is. It's a single house, but there are lots of other types of Charleston houses. But Andrew's very persistent and showed them that, in fact, there were many houses or at least some houses in Charleston that used post and beam construction. This was built in collaboration with the College of the Building Arts, which has a timber construction program. And it's a post and beam house where the post and beam construction is used for the porches, and also for the ground floor, which is a big open space, but not in the bedrooms. You don't need post and beam construction if you're building little bedrooms and bathrooms. In fact, the posts usually get in the way and they look sort of clunky. So the upstairs is sort of conventional and the downstairs is post and beam, but very beautifully pegged, all pegged together in a very kind of Gouldian way. Andrew's parents at one point realized, as anyone does who builds a house, building a house, especially if you're older, is a big job. And the thought of building a second one is kind of daunting. And besides which, they had got used to having a nice garden in front of their house. And so they decided that they wouldn't go ahead with the idea of building a rental house. But they were staring at this rather decrepit old building, which had a lot of sheds and things on the back, and they really wished somebody would do something with it. And so they convinced Jerry that he really ought to renovate that building. And Jerry said, well, at this point, Reed had moved to Charleston and was pretty much settled on becoming a developer. And Jerry thought he should really have the experience of renovating a house. Renovating a house, as all the architects here know, is not the same as building a new one. It's actually more difficult. And so Jerry said, I'll give you a mortgage on the house, and Andrew's father gave him a loan so that he could pay for building materials and construction, and this became a project, Reed's second project as a developer. As I told you, the downstairs had been pretty much abandoned for several decades, and when they took off that imitation sort of a masonry finish that was very popular in the 50s, I think, what they discovered was that there were major problems with foundations. Actually, there weren't any. It really needed to be seriously fixed. And so here's the mid-construction photograph where they're putting in the foundation and they'll lower the house back on them. And in the end, they turned it into a very attractive single house. It actually has 2 small units on the ground floor and 1 larger unit on the second floor. So it really houses 3 people, 3 or more, but generally 3 people. You can see the tandem parking on the right-hand side. There's a view of the porch. Andrew's office was in a building that George's brother, who's another character in the story, but I won't go into it here, had built as a kind of little office building, but he had finally decided to convert it into a condominium building, so Andrew had to find a new place for an office, and he convinced his parents that they should build an outbuilding at the back of their lot, just on the other side of the garden. And he convinced the city that because they were related, this wasn't really a business. It gets complicated at that point. But in any case, the city goes along with it, and he builds this little outbuilding, which has an office on the second floor. And the ground floor is partly a sort of small garden shed, but also a little small apartment currently occupied by a medical student. So in 2013, 6 or 7 years, it's pretty complete. It's this funny little group of houses that are kind of go together and don't go together, and there's some sort of beauties and some run-of-the-mill houses and old houses and new houses, a whole mixture of things. They've kept the trees, which are of course a big plus in any project. The numbers are the number of occupants. So you've got 21 people living on 2/3 of an acre. That's 30 persons per acre. That's a high density. And there's still 2 lots that are not built. There's a top right-hand corner and the one in the middle. So it's a very high density in basically 3-story buildings with one exception. The parking is all outdoor parking. And you'll see in the next phase of this, the density goes up, but then you have to put the cars underneath somehow. And then in the next level, you have to start talking underground, which of course you can't do in Charleston, but in other areas you might. At this point, Reed has definitely moved to Charleston, and his partner, Sally, has moved too, and he decides that really they should build a house. The problem is that Sally wants a garden, which of course the Palladian house doesn't have, and Reed has a grand piano, which wouldn't fit in the Palladian house. So he really needs a bigger house. Not a huge house, but larger than either of those lots that are left that I showed you in the previous slide. And the problem is that land has become pretty expensive in the center of Charleston. So buying a sort of medium-sized lot is really beyond his budget. And then he has this idea, well, what if he builds a house on a bigger piece of ground and then develops the rest of the lot and sort of pays for the cost of the land by selling off lots, subdividing the rest of the land. And it turns out that the land next door is actually a big empty lot. It's used by a landscape what do you call it, landscape contractor for storing peat moss and soil and things, gravel and sand and stuff like that. And so he approaches the owner, and the owner is willing to sell. It's pretty expensive. I can't remember how many millions at this point, but it certainly would have been way out of line for any kind of individual house. So his idea is to build his house is essentially a two-story house, which is inward looking. I'll show you a plan in a minute, looking towards a courtyard. So it's going to be completely surrounded by the other houses, by the other lots. Here's a plan. You can see that there's a courtyard where you enter, and the houses relate to that. There's a loggia, and then there's a couple of places where the house can look out from the piano room and the dining room. But basically, the whole house is on this one floor. There's a couple of guest rooms above, and then below you have cars, storage, and a couple of small rental units. The courtyard is raised up, so the one story below the courtyard is full of soil. So you can really grow big stuff in there. It's a real garden. George and Reed designed this together, and George's idea is to base it on San Clemente al Valterno, which is basically the idea here was that it's this mixture of classical and Renaissance, the arches of the church loggia, and then the more Roman style kind of atria or loggia on each side. And in a very small way, that's what they finally do, where the loggia gets the arches, and then on one side you have this more classical, it's almost as if it was a ruin leftover from an older building, which it was, of course, in Rome, but not in Charleston. So here's the house on the lot. They figured they could put about 10 small houses around it, and that's what George, who's taking the lead in the planning section. Here's some models that he's working with. A very narrow lane leading in. The parking mostly has to be under the building, so the buildings have to be 4 stories. That's a story of parking, and then this is not new urbanism. It's a sort of weird mixture. I don't know if you know Portmeirion, the project in Wales. I can't think of the architect's name just now. It was somewhat similar to Reed because he wanted to build something, and to pay for it, he sort of turned it into a little resort village. In that case, the architect designed everything himself, and Reed does not want that. Reed wants a mixture of architects. But there's some similarities to that. It's also kind of similar to the work that Misner did in Palm Beach, especially the little shopping mall that he designed. Because there are no rules. What Reed does is first of all, he picks the architects that he's going to work with, the designers, many of which he knows, like Andrew and George, and other ones that he's met. And rather than give them a sort of rule book, he gives them a number of things, including this picture of a model of the set for Porgy and Bess from the original production in New York. And of course, Porgy and Bess is set, as you know, in Charleston. So that's the connection. And the other inspiration for this are courtyards and groups of houses that he's seen in Rome and in Italy, old medieval groups that have a feeling. He doesn't quite achieve this. This is a little bit beyond most architects' means. It's just too funky. But as you see, I think he gets close. He has a number of architects working. Bevan and Liberatos do the first 2 houses. You can see here what the advantage now is, that you can enter the project from 3 sides. From Bogart Street in the south, you can enter from that lane that was the original first phase of all this, from Ashley Avenue, but there's also a connection under the building to the Crosstown Expressway, which is a big important thoroughfare that leads you onto the bridge and various other parts of Charleston. So you've got a number of architects here. There's also a house on the bottom left-hand corner, which was an existing house that the owner is a lawyer who lives in Bermuda, and her mother, when she died, left her this house. And so Andrew Gould was hired the house was in terrible shape, had not been lived in for a couple of decades, so it was really bad. And Andrew did a really very good job of restoring the house and making it livable again. She joined in to the sort of group. This is now a group of both projects are all together. So you've basically got a sort of condominium of 20 odd houses. And there's a view of the final one. I'm hoping many of you will go this afternoon and see the project. This was taken some few years ago. The interesting building on the left is a building by Andrew Gould. It's an extension to his house. Andrew extended his family, so he needed an extension to his house at the same time. And this is an interesting building because it's a kind of Mount Vernon type of situation of using wood to simulate masonry. And of course, the architectural board got a little bit upset by this. How could you do this? And he showed them a number of houses in Charleston that indeed used that precise approach. He had to leave. He made a sort of deal with the condominium, of which he's a part owner, that he would provide 2 parking spaces. The project was running out of parking, and so those are 2 parking spaces, not for him, but for one of the houses in the group underneath. And you can see the alley, which was called Catfiddle Street, going under the building and then going through and connecting to the Crosstown Expressway. I thought I should somehow give you some theory of something. It's not just a story. And this is a very interesting book by Christopher Alexander from 1987. It's called A New Theory of Urban Design. It's not one of his best-known books, and partly because many of his books are about real projects, real buildings. And this is a student studio that he carried out. So it's not an actual building. It's a sort of trial run of an idea he has of how you might design urban fabric. I think he used a large site in San Francisco in a sort of progressive way. And out of this exercise, he developed 4 principles, what they call organic urban growth. One was that it should be piecemeal, which certainly what I've shown you is very piecemeal because it comes together little bit by bit and is never quite sure where it's going. And second, that it's unpredictable. It's not, and that's what makes it different than, say, Misner's work, which is at the end a plan. It's a total plan that he develops. He doesn't just stumble through it. This is much more like stumbling through it because it's not predictable. At the beginning, Jerry just buys one house and thinks maybe he'll add a couple in the back, and by the end, there's 10 houses, and by the very end, there's more than 20. The other principle that Alexander says is it should be coherent, and the coherence, I think, comes very much from the fact that these people work together, have worked together. They're all living in Charleston. I've given this talk and given it the somewhat corny title sometimes of locatecture. I'm not really saying we should adopt this term. It's pretty cheesy, but it does represent the fact that we've gotten used to gunslingers who come into town and do something and leave. Many of them, I suppose, sitting in the audience. These people live in Charleston. They know Charleston. They know the Board of Architectural Review. Andrew Gould, I think, knows the Charleston Building Code by heart at this point. And so the coherence comes very much from the fact that these people are all in some way on the same wavelength. Even though it's not always a smooth process, as I talk about in the book. There are tensions, and if you've noticed, sometimes it's people working with somebody, sometimes it's people who seem to be partners. It's a very kind of fluid arrangement. Alexander is always, in anything he does, there's always a kind of mystical element, and the fourth principle, full of feeling, is kind of mystical. I can't really explain it. I'm not sure exactly what he means, but I can illustrate it, because I think the project I showed you does illustrate full of feeling, and that this is a series of slides which takes you, there's this entrance to a little public alley. That piece of, I don't know what it was originally, it was a piece of wrought iron that Reed had recovered in Brooklyn years and years ago, and he just saved it, thinking that he might use it one day. And here it became an important part of this little sequence of entry into which basically leads to 3 or 4 houses. You can see the addresses on the left. You enter through there. There's some. I think those are either utility closets or garbage bin closets on the right-hand side. You go up the stairs. There's a door to the red house on the side there, and further up you see finally the sort of Chinesey entrance to Reed's courtyard. So there's a lot of feeling in there. As I said, it's hard to explain. It's I think impossible to write down as a requirement. You must have full of feeling, but it's there, and it's a very important part. And it led me to suggest that maybe there are really 5 principles of organic growth, and the 5th one is agency. Architects, particularly interested in urbanism, are often very interested in trying to discover a principle, a rule. You think of Camilo Sitte trying to kind of show you how the medieval layouts followed certain ideas that he's trying to elicit from the plans, or architectural codes or design codes or attempts. And I think in some ways that misses the point. It's the human agency that is at the center of this. It's the particular individuals making choices that produces Siena. It's the Sienese that produce Siena, not some kind of theoretical principle. And that's very much the case of this story. It's produced by the individuals who all have these strange and different backgrounds, Air Force pilots and formal architects and self-taught architects and builders and developers. It's a very motley crew, and yet you feel that somehow that's very much an important ingredient. It's unfortunately or fortunately, it's not possible to simply set down in black and white a list of rules and then give it to anybody. That's not going to produce something as wonderful and magical as this. So I thought I'd finish by giving credit to these people. Andrew Gould, as I said, was a graduate architect, formally trained. Vince Graham is, by now, I think, a famous developer of Ion, which you have or will visit, I hope. Jerry Moran is the Air Force pilot who is with George and a third partner, is what starts the story, where they buy a decrepit old building very much in the edge of Charleston, which actually falls down one night. It's fortunately empty, and it's actually George's first design building, because he has to now design something there to replace it. Reed Burgess is the mandolin player. The scribe is the scribe. Anne Howell is Vince Graham's assistant. And in many ways, the center of the story is George Holt, because in some ways he starts it all off. He has this idea of, with no background in construction or anything like that, he has this idea that he could buy an old house and fix it up and maybe live in it for a while to pay it off, and then rent it out and maybe buy another house. And that's what really starts this whole process going. The other people shown are people who have built, architects, in this case, all architects who are responsible for buildings at Cat Fiddle. So finally, it does come down to the people, I think, much more than to the rules. And the people, as we heard earlier, it's the place that forms the people. There's a number of quotes in the book of, over the years, people have realized that Charleston is really an unusual place that grows on people, that influences people, and then produces wonderful architecture like this. Thank you. Do we have time for questions? If nobody seems to be hustling me off, so if there are any, I'll try to answer. I've realized there's a lot that I haven't spoken about that buy the book. Yes.
Just a quick question about the lots. Once the houses were built, are they now having separate lots that fit themselves?
Yeah, the question is about the lots. Yes, the lots are separate. I mean, the street and the sort of infrastructure is communally owned, but the lots are, and the houses on them are privately owned. So there is a legal document which defines exactly who owns what and so on, yes. I should mention something which is kind of interesting, because I know a lot of the talks are going to be about the environmental issues that Charleston faces. The Cat Fiddle Street, under the street is an enormous water tank, so that when it rains, that fills up, and then it releases water slowly. And any project with more than, I think, half a dozen units must provide on-site storage, which is a $1 million investment for Reed, which is a major issue, but it's now required by the city in an attempt to control flooding. This is not a low area of the city, so it doesn't regularly flood. But it's, I think, a logical attempt to hold the water so that you don't get all the flooding all at once, and then you release the water into the municipal system over time more slowly. So that's a sort of particular infrastructure sort of burden that the developer faces, which of course explains why development projects are getting bigger and bigger, because if you're building 100 units, it's not such a big burden. If you're building 10 units, it adds a lot to each house. It adds $100,000 to each house, whereas if you're building 100 houses, you can spread it all out. So it's a kind of, it's the contradiction, which we'll hear about, I think, in the next session, of how does a city like Charleston develop, and how does it deal with scale and so on.
Thank you. This was a wonderful story about how a small community developed in a serendipitous way. How does Charleston differ from most of the United States, where something like this might really turn out to be an aesthetic disaster, given that it was worked on by the individuals who were building these houses?
That's a good question. To answer the question, you sort of have to go back to the Civil War, or maybe even before the Civil War. I mean, Charleston is an unusual city. It was arguably the richest city in the colonies. Not the biggest, but the richest. And a lot of that money went into architecture, which is why you have the beautiful buildings that we have here. On the other hand, when Charleston went into decline, after the Civil War, the cotton trade went down, And even earlier, as soon as steamships came in, the advantage of Charleston Harbor being on the sort of great route disappeared. Steamships could go anywhere. And so Charleston really went into a long decline, which architecturally turned out to be a plus, because in a decline you don't demolish buildings. So the fact that we have all these buildings is partly a result of that decline. Charleston never had a big urban renewal phase, for example, thank goodness. It never had a crosstown expressway and all the things that most cities are now stuck with. But what it did have, which was odd, was that it had old families that were linked to Charleston in sort of familial and emotional and not economic particularly. These were not necessarily rich families, but they were tied to Charleston in a way that's unusual for the United States. In the United States, you know, we're the country that invented the ghost town, after all. If things are not working out, you move on, usually westward, and try somewhere else. Maybe it'll work better. And they didn't do that in Charleston. They stuck it out. That is not typically American. It's almost un-American. You're supposed to move on and open up something else elsewhere. And you know, economists always worry when mobility goes down and stuff like. Well, there was no mobility here, and so that explains things like setting up the first historical zoning district in the country. Not when Charleston was rich, but when Charleston was poor. That's what's so interesting. It wasn't done at a sort of high point economically. It was really done when there wasn't, it was just done to save the buildings. Not to turn it into a tourist town, which it did, but that was not the thought at the time. So there's all these unusual, I think, elements in the story that do make it certainly not unique, but unusual and untypical, so that it's only sort of in the last several decades that, since 1980s, that maybe a bit earlier, that the fortunes of the city have gone up. And in the United States, if the urban fortunes going up is always a mixed blessing. And so Charleston just has to survive the boom. And if it can, there will be a bust, and it can go back to being small scale again, I think. But Gary Brewer's going to talk more about that in the next talk. So yes, it's not typical. It's unusual. There are many ingredients, not only architectural. Charleston's not a particularly interesting architectural plan. I mean, compared to Savannah, it's not interesting at all. But that turns out not to be that important. It is, as our introducer said, it's the people in the end that make the difference.